to be able to introduce two people who need no introduction. Paula Dobriansky, as I had the pleasure of working with her in public service 25 years ago and have watched with great admiration as her public service career has blossomed since then. I am struck by the fact that now she is in the private sector yet. Her dedication to public service, including service as chairman of our national board, continues undiminished. Dr. Zbignew has been a major voice for foreign policy even before he became President Carter's National Security Advisor in 1977. And as we'll see, he knows something about China. He won the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1981 in part because of the work he did to normalize U.S.-China relations. Since that time, he has continued to play a major role in U.S. foreign policy, especially from his positions, senior positions at the Council, the CSIS, the Council, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, as well as Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. He, just in the last 7 years, has written three different books, and he has also passed on his passion for foreign policy to his progeny. His son will go out and be the United States ambassador to Sweden in just a couple of weeks. So it's my great pleasure to present these two distinguished Americans. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get underway with our interview, and the focus is on China. Now, you had earlier a panel on China, but with Dr. Brzezinski, I want us to step back and take the strategic view. So, starting right in, my first question to you is, who is China today, and what is the relationship with the United States? Is China a friend or foe?
Or perhaps neither.
Or perhaps neither, or other.
It certainly is a rival. There's no doubt about it. China is rising dramatically. It is now the #2 world economic power. Its political standing is rising. So naturally, parallels can be drawn, for example, between Imperial Germany and Great Britain on the eve of World War I. And it was the inability of those two to handle the relationship that precipitated the conflict. We have had many years of conflict with China. Then conditions gradually changed, and as Russia became more concerned about the Soviet Union, Kissinger and Nixon opened the door, and then the situation froze. There was little progress, and finally President Carter decided to bite the bullet on this, and we had very intense negotiations in which I participated directly with Deng Xiaoping. Then we created a new relationship, including not only normalization, which is a very difficult issue, but collusion, cooperation together against the Soviet threat. But China was economically weak at the time. Now it is rising dramatically. So what is the answer? I think the answer really depends on how both of us play it. At this stage, my sense is that the Chinese realize, quite unlike the Germans in the Imperial Age, or the Soviet Union during the Cold War, that it is not in their interest to engage in a direct confrontation with the United States. And hence their policies, by and large, while assertive and self-serving, are still geared towards an avoidance of collusion between us and them. Same, I think, obligation rests on us. We have to realize that China is rising, that it's not in our interest to get into conflict with China, and that assimilating China into the international system is the way to go. And this is why 7 years ago I proposed that our relationship with China increasingly be viewed as a kind of geopolitical G2, even if we shouldn't be calling it as such, because others would be, of course, perplexed. And the fact of the matter is, we can collaborate much more effectively then engage in conflict, because conflict at this stage would be highly destructive to both of us.
Let me take it a step further. Are we in competition with one another?
Of course we are in competition, and we have to be alert to that. But competition doesn't have to be hostility. Competition doesn't have to be a head-on political conflict. And if both parties are deliberate in trying to avoid that, I think it is possible, given the complexity of the world and the overlapping interests of the United States and China, to avoid outright hostility. But it will take an effort by both sides. And that means, on the Chinese side, the leadership must be not overly ambitious, must have a sense of history and patience. On our side, I think it means something different and maybe more difficult. It means that our public opinion must be demagogued on this subject to the extent that it reduces America's freedom of action in the policies that it pursues, but on the contrary, drives America into adopting policies which will then, of course, be reciprocated by the Chinese in a very hostile fashion.
Let's look at the leadership. There will be a succession coming up, and Hu Jintao will be moving off the stage, and there are already designated leaders who will be taking the respective places, including his. Tell us a little bit about that. Can we expect any subsequent changes or more of the same?
Well, the Chinese are now roughly in the 15th, maybe 20th year of a bureaucratic process in which the ruling elite engages in a process of deliberate renovation, carefully calibrated and steered from the top. It started with Deng Xiaoping initiating it. He was still a revolutionary leader, whom I knew very well. Indeed, we struck a relationship of a kind which resulted in something historically unique. When he came to America, when we normalized relations with China, he came with his wife. And the first night, the first evening, he spent the evening with his wife at dinner in my house, with me and my wife and my children. And he was a really grand individual, a man with vision. And he determined that China has to transform itself economically, and that China has to collaborate with the United States in order to be able to do that. He was then followed by a series of general secretaries of the party who were outstanding people, but who encountered significant difficulties in defining policies that would adjust the political system to the dynamism of the changing socio-economic system. In recent years, they have managed to maintain stability. But what does worry me is that over the longer haul, a self-selected, bureaucratically centralized, and relatively arbitrary political leadership might face the dilemma of the inevitable decline in the quality of leadership. Because a self-selective process is inimical, ultimately, to outstanding talent and to fundamental innovation. And that is a problem that China could face in the years to come. But it isn't facing it yet. But there could be a downward trend in the quality of the individual leaders.
Interesting. Robert Kaplan recently wrote a book, it was about a year and a half ago, and in which he focused extensively on the military buildup executed by China, and with the focus especially on the Navy, and questioning what's the reason. So looking at this on the military front, what is the intent there? Why are the Chinese investing so much in their military and growing their military?
Well, first of all, investing so much, you're an American power player. Just think about our military budget. It's more than the budgets of all of the countries in the world combined per year. Are they investing so much? In that case, what are we investing? How do you measure that? The point I'm making is there is a fundamental disproportion, a basic disproportion between our military capabilities and our likely military capabilities over the next decade or two and the Chinese. Yes, the Chinese are increasing the Navy. Well, look at the map. and ask yourself, if you were a Chinese leader, wouldn't you want to have a neighbor that gives you access to the rest of the world when you are in fact encircled by the Russian navy in the north, by the Russian and by the American navy immediately between China and Japan and Korea, by the narrow passage through the South China Sea, and then the Malacca Strait, and the Indian Ocean, which is on the way to your economic partners in Europe and in the Middle East, and to Middle Eastern oil. You are, if you're Chinese, dependent on a lot of potential difficulties which could arise in this or that context. So having some sort of a navy makes enormous sense for them. There's been a lot of talk lately about the new Chinese aircraft carrier. You know, we have 13 carrier groups with enormous capacity for overseas performance, for fast conducting naval missions right off the China coast. The Chinese are not doing that to us. Now, this new Chinese aircraft carrier, which so many people delegate about, was built 20 years ago in the Ukraine. And the Ukrainians sold it for scrap. The Chinese modernized it. And are going to have aircraft at some point capable of flying off it. That aircraft carrier, if accompanied by other aircraft carriers, will give the Chinese the capacity to contest any effort to close the Indian Ocean to them. If it has a military purpose, it is much more to offset Indian capacity to impose restrictions on Chinese access to the world than on our naval capacity. And then take the most critical dimension of the world, the nuclear powers, nuclear weapons. It sounds awful to say, but the fact is, we have several thousand nuclear weapons, which are targeted on different objectives in some countries. China is one of them. This doesn't mean we're targeting China specifically for an attack, but we have an existential capacity to launch an all-out nuclear attack on China and several other countries, if we want to. The Chinese started developing their nuclear weapons in 1964. That's almost 50 years ago. They have at most several dozen ICBMs, several dozen, targeted on western United States, just a few cities in the west. On their deterrence doctrine, that is enough to prevent us from trying to use nuclear weapons against them. So the military disparities between us and the Chinese are enormous. Over the next several decades, they'll dramatically decrease. So it's important to talk to the Chinese about a stable military balance, if it is possible to reach one. But it's also terribly important not to demagogue the issue. And it is being demagogued in a country which right now is very confused about the world and very uneasy, and to some extent even anxious about the world.
So let me just take it one step further. Do you think it bears watching these developments?
Of course.
That's not
absolutely. But let's not that's a certain proportion and realize that the disparities are so great that over a considerable number of years still, they're not going to be very different. But in the long run, if China is economically successful, and we're still, if we decline, and we have to dramatically cut our military budgets and so forth, the balance could open. So it's something to think about seriously, but responsibly.
Speaking of the region, describe what you see as the relationship today between China and Taiwan. It has evolved in some ways, I think, with the new leadership in Taiwan, but how do you see it?
It's a deliberately ambiguous relationship in which the Taiwanese, I think, in the majority, the still majority, don't want to be part of the Chinese political system as such. But it is no longer a relationship of hostility and mutual ostracism. You know, now literally hundreds of thousands of Chinese from the mainland visit Taiwan, individually, and probably a larger number of Taiwanese visit China. And about 200 or more thousand Taiwanese live in retirement near Shanghai or in the Shanghai region, because that's an attractive region for them. So the relationship is mixed. They still formally both subscribe to the notion that there's only one China as a nation, but there's more than one China as state. If that can make itself durable by accommodation, the possibilities of conflict obviously decrease. But if Taiwan has to survive on American arms sales, then that's always going to be a complication in our relationship with NATO.
I have a couple more questions, but let me encourage you, if you have questions, to start going to the mic so we save some time. My next question for you is, Robert Zeller, when he was the Deputy Secretary of State, he gave a speech before the Asia Society, and he made an appeal to the Chinese to become responsible stakeholders and to become more active in issues like humanitarian crises and other ways in which they should be stepping forward and being constructive internationally. Do you think that China has evolved in these recent years and has become a responsible stakeholder in the global community?
I think it's evolving. Whether evolved, which is kind of a terminal use of the verb, is probably premature. But remember where they started from. They started from a level of poverty, literally poverty compared to the advanced world, as of 20 years ago. So I think they're making progress on that. Their relationship with some of the African countries is of mutual benefit, though I would imagine asymmetrically mutual benefit, which is more beneficial to the Chinese. So very deliberate, we're very calculating, we can be very self-serving. But China realizes that its standing in the world is also dependent on being viewed increasingly in a positive fashion. And that begins to affect its policies. Generally speaking, in the G20, for example, they've been acting responsibly. In fact, in the first emergency meeting of the G20 in Pittsburgh, it was President Obama and President Hu Jintao that took the lead in developing a collective responsible reaction to the crisis that we're facing. So yes, I think China is becoming increasingly a constructive member of the global community. But obviously, it has still a long way to go, given its very low starting point.
And one more before we go right over here. Does Europe matter these days?
Europe matters, but it would matter much more than it does. But I am on the view that Europe is going to be increasingly important. I think the present crisis, in a paradoxical way, may turn out to be salutary. It's a kind of crisis that makes you think of what the alternative actually is, which is like jumping off a cliff into an abyss. I think that is forcing the Europeans to recognize something fundamental. That there is a disjunction between the European Union as a monetary union and the European Union as a non-existent political union, because it is not a union. Politically, it's more a loose confederation, and the two cannot coexist. So it has to be one or the other. And since there is considerable benefit for the Europeans in having the euro, at least for its major players, and they are the decisive ones, I think the present crisis is going to force them to move in the direction of the political union catching up with the monetary union in terms of the degree of self-discipline and cohesion.
Okay, let's go over here.
Larissa Lino from Northrop Grumman, one of the sponsors. Thank you, Dr. Brzezinski, for being with us today. I'd like to ask you to assess the prospects for enhanced conflict over the islands in the South China Sea that are in dispute.
I think those conflicts are not going to erupt into any major violence. There have been some exchanges of animals between China and Vietnam. We have taken the public position that freedom of navigation is essential to international commerce, something which is even more essential to the Chinese than it is to us, because we control the oceans and we have access to the oceans. They don't have access to the larger ocean except through passage through the barriers that I've mentioned. So my guess is this is going to be adjudicated in some fashion, hopefully by perhaps international mediation or the international court. But in any case, at this stage of its own history, and rather ambitious history of the Chinese, it's not in their interest to precipitate a major collision over that issue.
Let's go over here, please.
Kind of branching off of the previous question.
Introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Chris Garson from Jacksonville, Florida. And somewhat in relation to the previous question, there was not so long ago, there was an incident with Japan on some of those islands, and the Japanese authorities ended up arresting the Chinese fishermen who rammed the boat into the Japanese boat multiple times and took them back to Japan. And the ordeal lasted for weeks. All of a sudden, rare earth metal shipments stopped shipping from China to Japan, vital to Japan's economy. And this was all in the stage of wide-eyed South Korea and the rest of the region. And especially in South Korea recently, the Chinese fishing boats drifting over to South Korea. And just recently, last month, South Korean Coast Guard died after being assaulted. But my question is, what advice would you give to the Southeast Asian, the other Southeast Asian countries, and using diplomacy as a tool to negotiate with China and talk with China, as China seems to become a little more erratic, and as the other countries are a little bit more adverse to confronting China given its economic power?
Well, I think this issue between the Chinese and the Japanese got out of hand rather quickly, and particularly produced a wave of very nationalistic reactions in China, including incidents at soccer matches and so forth, and of course threats. And in a curious and paradoxical way, it had the effect of then prompting the Chinese leadership to push back, to pull back, to sort of ease up. And the Chinese and the Japanese, in more recent times, have engaged in a series of reciprocal gestures designed to again engage in more constructive dialogue and to try to minimize the likelihood of repetition of incidents of this sort. But in the background of all of this, there is the reality that Chinese nationalism is a very powerful, very emotionalizing force in China. And it can erupt very dramatically. And that is one of the unknowns in the future of the relationship. Will, in fact, China, over the long haul, become increasingly nationalistic, assertive, unilateralist, in which case a lot of what seems feasible today, which is a kind of a stable, orderly relationship, could then be transformed into something much more ominous.
Let's go here.
Yes, Alan Livingston, Houston. One of the issues that has not been discussed at this conference so far in any details is North Korea. And since they're preparing for a power transfer to the sun sometime in the near future, China being the only country that seems to have any kind of influence within North Korea, can you talk a little bit about that future relationship, what we can look for China to play as an intermediate in the area of foreign relations with North Korea?
Well, the Chinese don't want either a war on the Korean Peninsula, nor a collapse of the North Korean regime and its assimilation into a pro-American Korea that is more or less also an extension of the American-Japanese-Korean triangle. So that is the major geopolitical preoccupation of the Chinese. You probably have noticed that the top North Korean leader has been, on a number of occasions in recent times, visiting China and sort of looking at what the Chinese are doing. And that strikes me, in all probability, as an attempt by the Chinese to, in a sense, educate them to what may be, in some circumstances, possible in North Korea, which is the gradual decentralization of the system, the gradual unleashing of the natural potential of an otherwise intelligent and creative society to perform well. Now, whether a paranoid, self-isolated regime such as the North Korean that draw those lessons from it, it's impossible for me to predict. Moreover, the very nature of the power transition is so archaic and so unrelated in times that one wonders how enduring in the longer run that's going to be. I mentioned earlier the dangers of a declining quality of leadership in a narrow bureaucratic setting. Think of the dangers of a declining quality of leadership in a narrow genetic relationship between a grandfather who is deified, a father who is the all-powerful dictator, and a young son who until recently was a playboy. How likely is that to produce on the long haul really reliable, acceptable leadership? It must also create real tensions within the system. The army, the bureaucracy of top leaders, they all must wonder, why are we living in this dynastic arrangement? And so I think instability in North Korea is a factor factor here that probably is as worrisome to the Chinese as it should be worrisome to us, the Japanese and the South Koreans.
Let's go here.
Marilyn McAfee from Jacksonville, Florida. We've been talking about during this conference about the danger of cyber attack, and we have been a victim of that in a very serious way. And the last time that it happened, while the White House did not say that it was Russia or China, it was pretty clear in the media that that's where they thought the responsible parties were. So my surprise was a bit when the White House reaction was, if this happens again, we will consider this an act of war. Because I was wondering, well, what would we do then? And does that kind of put us on a short leash in options? You know, there are not too many options in cyberspace. But then the other question is, do you think that's effective? And the companion question is, this is being done by the Chinese army. Obviously, it's not at the displeasure of the Chinese government, but do you think that an exercise like this could have occurred without the authorization of the Chinese leadership? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'm not so sure whether we've actually said that cyber penetration will be viewed by us as an act of war. Now, of course, if the Chinese were all of a sudden to paralyze our grids, shut off our lights, our heat, close down our industry, and so forth, we would view it as an act of war. We would view it as someone else did it. But I'm not sure the White House was so blunt and so kind of simplistic in saying that some sort of cyber penetration or interference would be viewed as an act of war. Because for one thing, we can't be totally sure. We have some reasons to believe that they're engaged in it. We have reasons to believe that other powers are engaged in it too, including Russia. There may be others as well, including some friends of ours. We are also indirectly involved, for example, in using some form of cyber warfare to sabotage, for example, the Iranian nuclear program. Maybe we're not doing it directly, but there's certain grounds to believe that we had something to do with the dissemination of the virus, which smashed up hundreds and hundreds of centrifuges in Iran. So a lot of this is going on, and it's focused more, in most cases, in my judgment, on intelligence acquisition. Intelligence acquisition of data regarding military preparations, planning, perhaps penetration of high-level policy, strategizing, and so forth. And that's part of the game that's been going on for a long time. There is, however, implicit in that capability the possibility of being used in a war. That is to say, as part of some confrontation in which all of a sudden country A disables country B entirely. The answer to that is, unless you can reach some convention that's credible and enforceable and subject to monitoring, to have an identical capability and to be able to do it to them. And I can speak about it because I don't know too much about it in detail. I sort of assume we're doing the same.
I have to apologize to the three at the mic. We're going to have to close. My apologies to you. I'm going to give you a 30-second question and we will close. National security issues, will they matter in the 2012 elections, presidential elections?
Well, yes, I think they could. And they might, even more so than before, for two reasons. One, our economic situation is such that national security problems are in some respects more acute than they otherwise would be. We also have an increasingly aroused population that's worried and concerned, but also is very, very susceptible, increasingly so, to demagogic appeals. And it's a population which, with the exception of members of the World Affairs Councils, is woefully ignorant about the world. And that's fact. I mean, most Americans don't know a damn about world geography or world history. The statistics of this are appalling. And most Americans don't follow international affairs the way we do, which means we have a population which makes decisions regarding our leadership and to whom candidates for leadership pander on the basis of moronic fears, idiotic assumptions, misinformation, and fundamental ignorance. That's not a